The call came in at 11:47 on a Saturday night, and the voice on the other end wasn't my mother's or my father's. It was a nurse from Riverside General who told me my 8-year-old daughter had been admitted in diabetic shock. After a neighbor found her sitting on the back porch steps in 32-degree weather, completely alone for 3 hours. 3 hours. I was in Chicago for a client emergency. A federal contractor had discovered a 7-figure discrepancy in their accounting systems, and my firm was the one they called. Sophie knew I was coming back Sunday. She wasn't scared to stay at my parents' place in Cincinnati for one night. She'd stayed there before, and she trusted her grandfather Harold. She thought he'd keep her safe. The neighbor who found her was an older woman named Mrs. Calloway who lived 2 houses down. She'd heard Sophie crying through the fence and climbed over in her bathrobe to get to her. By then, Sophie's glucose had crashed so hard she could barely lift her head. Mrs. Calloway called 911. The paramedics arrived in 4 minutes. The hospital called me 2 minutes after that. My parents didn't call. My sister didn't call. Her husband didn't call. I was in my car heading to the airport before the nurse had finished the sentence. My name is Kayla. I'm 34 years old. For 6 years, I worked as a forensic accountant with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit in Columbus, which means I spent most of my career following money through shell companies, offshore accounts, and forged documents until it led me to people who thought they were too smart to get caught. 3 years ago, I left and built my own firm, a private financial investigations company that works with corporations and federal agencies on fraud detection. My family thought I was just a bookkeeper with a fancy title. They had no idea what I actually did or who I actually knew. Sophie has had type 1 diabetes since she was 5. She wears a continuous glucose monitor on her arm at all times. She carries a glucagon kit in her backpack. Every adult in her life knows the protocol. If her CGM alarms, you get her juice or glucose tablets immediately. You do not wait. You do not ignore it. You especially do not lock her outside in the cold, where physical stress will drive her blood sugar off a cliff within 30 minutes. My brother-in-law Devin knew that. He'd been briefed on it twice. He was my sister Renee's husband. They'd been married 4 years, and from the beginning, something about him never sat right with me. He was charming in the way that people are charming when they need something from you. All smooth words and easy smiles, and the moment the deal was done, the warmth just switched off like a light. He worked in commercial real estate, which is how he met my father Harold, who'd spent 30 years building a property management business in the Cincinnati area. My father didn't have $1 billion, but he had more than enough: a portfolio of rental properties, 2 commercial buildings downtown, and a farmhouse on 40 acres outside the city that had been in our family for 3 generations. When Devin started dating Renee, he started spending a lot of time in my father's office. I noticed no one else seemed to. I landed at CVG at 2:15 in the morning and drove straight to the hospital. Sophie was in the pediatric ICU. They'd gotten her glucose stabilized, but the hypothermia had hit her hard. She'd been sitting outside in a thin pajama top and no socks. Her fingers were still pale when I got to her room. She was asleep, hooked to a monitor, her little glucose sensor blinking orange on her arm. I stood at the window for a long time and did not cry. That's not coldness. That's the training. 6 years in financial crimes means you learn to separate what you feel from what you need to do next. Because the moment you let the feeling take the wheel, you make mistakes. I was not going to make mistakes. I was standing in the hall outside her room when I heard my father's voice at the nurse's station. He was asking which room she was in. I stepped into the middle of the corridor and waited. Harold came around the corner and stopped. He was wearing a button-down shirt that wasn't wrinkled enough. He hadn't been asleep when he came. He'd had time to dress. He looked at me the way people look at a car accident they drove past and hoped no one noticed them witnessing. His face went pale. Kayla. He said my name like it was a question he didn't want answered. I told him that Sophie's CGM had alarmed. I told him the hospital records showed her glucose had been dropping for 45 minutes before she went into shock. I asked him if he heard the alarm. He straightened his shoulders. That was always his tell. When he was about to say something he knew was indefensible, he stood up straighter, as if posture could add credibility to whatever came next. He told me Sophie had been acting up all evening. He said she'd gone into Devin's private office. His office, which the kids were not allowed in, and she'd been caught trying to get into Devin's desk drawer. He said Devin had told her to go to her room and she'd mouthed off, and then apparently wandered outside on her own. My daughter weighs 53 pounds and is afraid of thunderstorms and cried for a week when our fish died. She had never once in her life mouthed off to an adult. I told him the hospital had logged 3 hours between her last known indoor location and when the neighbor found her. I told him that her CGM alarm is loud enough to hear 2 rooms away and that it had been going off the entire time. I told him a woman in her 70s climbed a fence in a bathrobe to get to my child while 4 adults were inside that house. He waved his hand. He told me I was being dramatic and that Sophie was fine. I pulled out my phone and called my analyst. His name is Miles. He was a forensic IT specialist I'd worked with at the bureau and now contracted through my firm. I told him I needed him to pull whatever he could from the security system at my parents' property, camera footage, access logs, alarm records. My parents had installed a basic home security setup 2 years ago. I'd helped them pick the system. I knew the cloud backup ran a 72-hour rolling archive. Miles said he'd start immediately. I went back into Sophie's room, sat down next to her bed, and held her hand until the sky outside the window turned gray. Renee arrived at 8 in the morning with Devin and their son Brock. Brock was 9, stocky for his age, the kind of kid who'd been told his whole life that he was exceptional. He walked into the hospital lobby with his hands in his pockets and didn't look towards Sophie's room once. Renee didn't ask how Sophie was doing. She told me Devin was really upset about what happened to his office. I let her talk. I watched Devin while she did. He was standing a few feet back, arms crossed, scanning the corridor. When his eyes landed on me, he held the look for just a second too long, the way people do when they're deciding whether they're worried. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. He held it out and said it was to cover the medical expenses and anything else Sophie needed. He said it was the least he could do, given how frightening the situation must have been. His voice was perfectly calibrated, sympathetic enough to sound decent, flat enough to signal that this was a transaction, not an apology. I took the envelope. Inside was a personal check for $35,000. I looked at the routing number at the bottom. It wasn't from a standard consumer bank. It was a routing prefix I recognized from my years at the bureau, the format used by private banking arms that service high-net-worth clients with offshore account structures. Devin leaned in slightly and lowered his voice. He told me he was sure I understood that this kind of situation was best handled privately. He said, "My father's business reputation mattered to a lot of people in Cincinnati, and a public incident involving a child could create misunderstandings that would be difficult to untangle. He told me he'd hate to see anyone have to lawyer up over something that was ultimately an accident." I folded the check and put it in my pocket without saying anything. He smiled. It was the smile of someone who believed they'd just solved a problem. What he didn't know was that I'd been holding that check by the very edge, the same way I'd been trained to handle potential evidence. I had his fingerprints. I had a routing number. And I had a forensic IT specialist who was currently pulling 72 hours of camera footage from a cloud server in a data center in Arizona. Miles called me at noon. He'd gotten the footage. He told me to find somewhere private. I went to a family lounge at the end of the hall and locked the door. The footage was clear. My parents' system used 1080p cameras with infrared for low light, which is exactly why I'd recommended it to them. The timestamp I asked Miles to pull first was from the study, 8:43 p.m., the window between when my father said Sophie had wandered in and when Mrs. Calloway found her at 11:20. At 8:43, the study showed Devin and Renee at the desk. There were documents spread across the surface, thick stacks, the kind that come from a title company or an estate attorney. Renee had a pen in her hand and she was writing onto a signature line at the bottom of a page. She wasn't signing her own name. She was practicing loops, adjusting the pressure, going back to a reference sheet on her left. She was copying my father's signature. I watched her sign 3 documents. At 8:51, the door opened. Sophie walked in wearing her pajamas, the ones with the little planets on them, the ones she'd packed herself because they were her favorites. She was holding her stuffed rabbit. She rubbed her eyes and looked around the room. Renee froze. Devin moved fast. He swept the documents off the desk and shoved them into a leather portfolio. He crossed the room in 4 steps and grabbed Sophie by the arm. I could see Sophie's face. Confused, not frightened yet, just confused in the way a half-asleep child looks when something doesn't make sense. Then Brock came in from the hallway. He was bigger than Sophie by a full head. He grabbed her other arm and started pulling her toward the back of the house. Sophie tried to pull back. I could see her trying, and she dropped her rabbit on the floor. She turned to look at it. Brock didn't let her stop. At 8:54, the exterior porch camera showed Brock pushing Sophie out the back door. She stumbled on the threshold and barely caught the railing. The door shut behind her. 3 seconds later, I heard the deadbolt. The footage had audio, a clean, solid click. She stood on the porch for a moment looking at the door, then she sat down on the steps. Her glucose monitor would have started alarming around 9:15. Her body, stressed and cold and without the snack she should have had at bedtime, would have been burning through her reserves fast. By 10:30 she would have been too weak to bang on the door anymore. Mrs. Calloway found her at 11:20. I sat in that family lounge for a long time after the footage ended. I wasn't just a mother looking at what had been done to her daughter. I was a forensic accountant looking at evidence of a crime with a very specific shape, and the shape of it told me exactly what was underneath. I called Miles back and gave him the routing number from Devon's check. He came back to me in 40 minutes. What he found was not just a private banking account. The routing prefix traced to a correspondent banking structure used by a Delaware LLC that was nested inside two other shell companies, a chain specifically designed to obscure the origin of funds. Devon's name didn't appear anywhere on the surface, but when Miles dug into the registered agent filings, one name appeared consistently across all three entities: Renee's name listed as the authorized signatory. She wasn't an innocent bystander, she was the legal shield. And the documents they'd been signing that night, Miles was able to partially reconstruct them through the camera footage. He pulled in a real estate attorney who owed me a favor and gave her the document dimensions, the notary stamp visible in one corner, the title company letterhead on the reference sheet. She came back in 3 hours with a match, a quitclaim deed template commonly used to transfer property interests outside of probate. Someone was moving property out of my father's estate, quietly, while he was still alive. They needed the farmhouse and both commercial buildings transferred out of Harold's name before his health got worse. My father had been managing a cardiac condition for 2 years and into entities Devon controlled. If Harold died even with a basic will, those properties would go through probate and the transfers would be scrutinized. They needed his signature, real or forged, on record first. They needed it done before anyone started asking questions. Sophie had walked in at the exact wrong moment. She hadn't done anything wrong. She'd just been a little girl looking for someone familiar in a house that felt suddenly strange, and they had locked her outside in 32-degree weather to protect a forgery. I made 2 calls. The first was to a former colleague at the FBI's field office in Cincinnati. When I told him I had camera footage of document forgery, an offshore fund structure, and quitclaim deeds prepared outside probate, he went quiet for exactly 3 seconds and then asked me to encrypt and send everything to his secure line. The second call was to the hospital billing department. I'd already guessed what was coming. Devon wasn't going to leave that check as a gift. It was leverage, and the moment I showed any sign of fighting back, he'd pull it. I asked the billing coordinator to give me the current balance on Sophie's account. She gave me the number. I gave her my firm's corporate card, the kind issued to businesses clearing more than $1 million a year in expenses, and asked her to run the full balance and flag Sophie's file for direct billing going forward. The coordinator didn't say anything for a moment, then she said, "Yes, ma'am," and I could hear the shift in her voice. Devon called me 20 minutes later. He told me he'd just gotten off the phone with my father's insurance provider and initiated a coverage review on Sophie's hospitalization. His voice was completely even. He wanted me to understand he could do this without raising it. I told him Sophie's balance had already been cleared. There was a pause. I told him the check he'd given me was going somewhere he hadn't planned, and I thanked him for being so thoughtful. I hung up. Miles had the full financial dossier ready by midnight. Devon's web of shell companies, the property transfer documents, the offshore fund flows, 3 years of wire transfers Renee had authorized, all of it packaged into a master file with a chain of custody log clean enough to hold up in federal court. He'd also found something else. Devon had applied for a home equity line of credit against my parents' farmhouse 6 weeks prior, listing himself as an authorized agent. My father's signature was on the application. When Miles compared it to Harold's signature on the original mortgage documents from 1997, the inconsistencies were obvious to anyone who knew what to look for. They'd been practicing for a while. I spent Sunday at the hospital with Sophie. She woke up properly around 2 in the afternoon. Her color was back. She asked me if her rabbit was okay. I told her I'd get her a new one just like it. She pulled her oxygen mask down slightly. Her voice was thin and a little hoarse. She told me she was sorry for going into her uncle's office. She said she heard a noise and got scared and didn't know where Grandpa was, and she just wanted to find someone. I pulled my chair right up to the side of the bed. I told her she had done absolutely nothing wrong. I told her she was not in any kind of trouble and she never would be. I told her the only thing she needed to think about was getting better, and that she was the bravest person I had ever met, and I meant every word. She looked at me for a second, then she said Brock had told her, right before he pushed her out the door, that I wasn't coming back, that I had a new job and had decided to leave her with the family for good. That was what Devin had told a 9-year-old boy to say to my 8-year-old daughter in order to keep her quiet. I stayed calm until she fell back asleep. Then I walked to the family lounge at the end of the hall, closed the door, sat in the dark for about 3 minutes, and let myself feel exactly how angry I was. Then I stood up and went back to work. My father's company held an annual dinner every year at the end of May, a client appreciation event he'd been running for 15 years, always at the same banquet hall on the east side of Cincinnati. Local contractors, property managers, longtime tenants, a few city council members. Harold had always used it to remind people who he was. It was scheduled for the following Friday. I let them have the week. On Friday evening, I wore a navy blazer with my credentials on my belt and walked into that banquet hall at 8:45, right when the program was starting. My father was at the podium at the front of the room. Renee and Devin were at the head table. Brock was seated beside his mother, picking at the bread rolls. There were about 120 people in the room. I walked in from the back and stood in the center aisle. My father saw me first. He stopped mid-sentence. Devin turned in his chair, and his face went through about 4 different expressions in under 2 seconds before he settled on indignation. He stood up and came toward me, keeping his voice low enough that only the nearby tables could hear. He told me this was a private event and I needed to leave before I embarrassed myself. I told him I was happy to keep it brief. Miles had arranged a Bluetooth connection to the hall's presentation system earlier in the week, a simple administrative login to the AV vendor's remote management portal. The footage pulled up on the projector screen behind my father's podium without any drama. Just the clear, quiet video from 8:43 p.m. on a Saturday night, a room full of documents, and my sister's hand moving across the bottom of a page that wasn't hers to sign. The room went silent. I didn't narrate it, I didn't explain it, I let it run. Devin grabbed for my tablet. A former colleague of mine, a 6'2" forensic specialist who happened to be standing near the wall, stepped forward and made it very clear that wasn't going to happen. Renee stood up from the table and started crying immediately, not the kind of crying that happens when something breaks inside you, but the kind that's a reflex, a way of making noise to fill the space where accountability would otherwise land. She told the room I was unstable. She said I'd been harassing her family for years. She looked around at the guests and appealed to them like a lawyer appeals to a jury, and I watched the jury's faces and I could see it wasn't working. My father hadn't moved. He was still standing at the podium, looking at the screen. He watched his daughter's hand copy his signature on a deed to the farmhouse that had been in our family since 1962. He watched Devin shove the documents away when Sophie walked in. He watched Brock drag Sophie down the hall. When the footage ended, Harold stepped away from the podium and sat down in a chair near the wall. He looked like something had left him, not his health, not his dignity, but something older than either of those things, something he'd been holding for a long time. The FBI agents came through the side entrance 11 minutes later. They'd been staged 2 blocks away. Devin was arrested on 3 counts: wire fraud, forgery of financial instruments, and conspiracy to commit elder financial abuse. Those charges carry a combined maximum of over 30 years in federal court. A forensic team was already executing a search warrant on his home office. Renee was taken in for questioning. She was released that night, but the federal freeze on her accounts meant her credit cards stopped working before she got home. Brock stood in the corner of the banquet hall watching his father be handcuffed, and for the first time I had ever seen, he looked like an ordinary 9-year-old who had no idea what was happening. I didn't feel nothing about that. But I also knew that what he'd learned to do in that house had been taught to him, and it would take a lot longer than one night to unlearn. My father came to find me after the agents left. The room had mostly cleared. Harold walked over to where I was standing by the windows. He looked smaller than I'd remembered. He asked me if I had known for a long time. I told him I'd known something was wrong. I hadn't known the scale of it until Saturday night. He nodded slowly. He looked out at the parking lot for a while. Then he said he wanted me to have power of attorney over the estate accounts. He said he wanted me to be the one to handle it going forward. I looked at him for a long moment. I thought about everything I could have said. I thought about Sophie on those porch steps. I thought about the rabbit she'd dropped on the hardwood floor and the sound of that deadbolt clicking shut. I told him I'd think about it. I told him he needed to call his estate attorney in the morning and have every document Devon had ever touched reviewed. I told him to change every password and every authorized signatory on every account by end of business Monday. And I told him that if he ever again suggested my daughter needed more discipline, he would be managing those accounts completely on his own. He said, okay, just that, no posture behind it, no authority, just a man trying to figure out what came next. Devon's trial took 8 months. His attorneys tried 3 different strategies, and all 3 failed. He was sentenced to 11 years in a federal facility in Indiana, no early release provision. The shell company assets were seized and liquidated. Renee's access to those funds disappeared overnight. She moved into a studio apartment in Norwood and got a job at an office supply store. The same woman who used to text me pictures of her kitchen renovation and ask why I wasn't doing more with myself was now working the register on weekday mornings. I don't wish her worse than what she got, but I don't lose sleep over it either. Sophie recovered completely. By September, she was running around at recess and arguing with me over bedtime like nothing had ever happened. Her counselor told me she was processing everything well, that kids her age are more resilient than we tend to give them credit for, and that the most important thing was that she felt safe and believed. I made sure she knew both of those things every single day. The last thing I did before I closed the case file was send my father's estate attorney a complete copy of the forensic audit my firm had produced. Every document, every wire transfer, every shell company registration indexed and annotated. I attached a 1-page cover letter on my firm's letterhead. I signed it with my full credentials. Not because anyone needed to be reminded of what I did for a living, but because I had spent a very long time in that family being treated like someone who didn't matter, and I wanted it on the record, the official, permanent, legally admissible record, that it was me who found it, me who built the case, and me who made sure no one walked away clean. Sophie got a new rabbit. She named it Biscuit. It goes everywhere with her now. That's enough. That's more than enough. And I would do every single bit of it again, without hesitating for a second.